Details of the large-scale disorder that recently took place in Leicester, a city that has been described by Hindus and Muslims in a joint statement as a beacon of diversity and community cohesion, are well known to most of us here, I think, tonight. We're also by now familiar with many of the explanations for these tensions, some of which were touched upon by my colleague James. These range from the victory celebrations that flared up following the cricket match between India and Pakistan, to a flashpoint incident, so-called, that got out of hand, to disinformation and other social media stuff that distorted what is happening between different communities, to no obvious local cause whatsoever. Now, these latter explanations were proposed by Peter Soulsby, the current mayor of Leicester. But there are clearly more complex factors at play. And while some of my other colleagues here on this panel are in a much better position than I to address the issues that relate specifically to the local context, my role here is to consider some of the patterns and parallels that I see between the communal tensions we've witnessed in Leicester and those that have unfolded in central India, where I have carried out ethnographic research for over 2 decades. So let me first give a brief overview of my own research background. I began my fieldwork as an anthropologist in central India in the late 1990s. My original focus was on the ethno-religious relationship between some of the most socio-economically deprived communities in the country, Hindu and Christian Adivasis, or scheduled tribes, all subsistence farmers living below the poverty line. My research soon shifted to the communal tensions that began to escalate between these two groups in an attempt to understand how an otherwise peaceful, harmonious village could descend into potentially violent conflict. This initial period of fieldwork lasted for 2 years, and tensions during this period included allegations by members of the Hindu community against the Christian community of alcohol-related conspiracies to bring the Hindu community down, accusations by both communities against the other of thefts of land and livestock, the destruction of a Christian cross and shrine by local Hindus, which had been erected at the top of a sacred hill, and threats by members of the Hindu community to burn Catholic priests alive in their jeep. These tensions, along with other threats of violence in the village and surrounding area, mapped onto and in some ways were inspired by acts of violence that occurred elsewhere in the country at the time. Indeed, my analysis showed that they were directly linked to the Hindu nationalist movement spreading throughout India during this period, the late 90s. The BJP, India's right-wing Hindu nationalist party, had come into power in 1998. This party is committed to Hindutva, an ideology that aims to transform India's diverse religious cultures, Muslim, Christian, along with myriad forms of Hinduism that are found throughout the subcontinent, into an undifferentiated Hindu whole, for the purpose of creating one nation, one people, one culture. Such aims, incidentally, go emphatically against the kind of secularist ideals advocated by Jawaharlal Nehru, India's first prime minister, for whom the nation's ethno-religious diversity was one of its greatest strengths. Along with its allied organizations, the BJP uses a number of different strategies to transmit its Hindutva ideology to disparate cultures and draw them into the Hindu nation, including those related to the kind of tensions and violence, both symbolic and very real, that I observed during my fieldwork. Now, I could certainly say more about these strategies and the tensions that unfolded locally. But how can these observations, gleaned from my 2 decades-old research in central India, possibly enhance our understanding of recent events in Leicester? In the brief time that remains, let me highlight 3 connections that I see between my research and the Leicester context in the hope that this will facilitate further understanding. First is the involvement of outsiders. Here, outsiders take the form of both ideologies and individuals who intervene in local activities and events to help foment communal conflict. Now, blaming outsiders for importing potentially threatening ideologies is a particularly useful explanatory tool, as this absolves the otherwise peaceful reputation historically attached to a particular area and its people in Leicester or in rural central India. In the Central India context, for example, there are several categories of outsiders. First, we have the instigators of the communal tensions that I witnessed that were initiated by Hindutva activists who came from outside of the village for the purpose of spreading Hindu nationalism. These outside activists were in part motivated by a second group of outsiders, local Christians, mainly Adivasis who had immigrated to the area one generation previously from another part of India, bringing what the Hindutva activists described as anti-Hindu beliefs with them. A third outside group consisted of the church itself, which was attached to a global Christianity whose headquarters were outside India, that is Rome, and whose alleged aim was, remember, to bring the Hindu community down. The rhetoric, this outsider rhetoric features in Leicester as well, with reports in the media suggesting that the violence was instigated in part by those who came from outside the city, nearby Birmingham, but also Luton and London, for the express purpose of stirring up trouble. Immediately following the conflict, Hindu and Muslim religious leaders issued a joint statement, calling upon the inciters of hatred to leave our city alone and reiterating that, and I quote, "Leicester has no place for any foreign extremist ideology that causes division." Mayor Peter Soulsby made the same point when announcing the inquiry into the events, stating that it would be necessary to investigate whether the disturbances were, and I quote, "motivated by extreme ideologies imported from elsewhere." So at this point we see how outsiders can be implicated in the escalation of communal tensions as they allegedly bring their aims and ideologies into an otherwise very peaceful city, Leicester, or rural village in central India, disrupting the existing ethno-religious harmony and, quote, "very good relations between people of faith." Again, these are statements from Mayor Soulsby. The extent to which those involved in such tensions actually come from outside is, of course, contested. But in many ways, this is immaterial. The important point here is to highlight the powerful role and rhetoric of the outsider, real or presumed, in the rise of communal tension. Second is the cultivation of the threatening other, which is of course related to and often construed as an outsider, historically at least, and often attached to a powerful external body, global Islam, for example, or global Christianity, against whom the threatened local must resist. In India, this threatening other invariably refers to one who stands against the broader rights of Hindu people. Historically, and particularly since the rise of the Hindutva ideology in the early 1990s, the Muslim community has been designated as the primary threat against the Hindu majority. In central India, however, this threatening other is the Christian, or more broadly, the Christian church, which was charged with engaging in subversive activities, particularly amongst rural Adivasis, thereby constituting a risk to the wider community of Hindus. In the UK context, this threatening other trope generally refers to the so-called Muslim terrorist. It's used as justification to instigate violence for the purpose of protecting the broader community. One very clear example of how this threatening other was manifested specifically in the context of Leicester is the slogan that was chanted during the communal tensions, Jai Shri Ram, victory or glory to Lord Ram, a traditional religious Hindu greeting that has evolved over the past few decades into a chauvinist slogan directed at those considered to be a threat to Hindu supremacy, namely Muslims, in contexts of potential or real violence. Here then we see how the notion of the threatening other gives rise to a more singular religious or communal identity, resulting in increasing divisions and further polarization of local relations. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, is the issue of economic and social deprivation. The Hindu nationalist movement in India tailors itself very effectively to the needs and circumstances of economically marginalized groups, promising and indeed providing support and upliftment of those communities in exchange for allegiance to the Hindutva cause. Interestingly, this is not unlike the proselytizing strategies utilized in 19th century Christian missionary movements, who devoted themselves to the social upliftment of disparate groups. In the Central Indian context, the extreme poverty and material deprivation experienced by marginalized Adivasi communities made rural India an obvious site for both Christian missionaries in the 19th century and militant Hindu nationalists in the past 2 decades to spread its ideologies, using social upliftment and other strategies to do so. The manner by which the BJP and its allied organizations tailor their Hindutva agenda to different socioeconomic contexts, cultures, and communities is well known. The kind of strategies utilized to draw Adivasi communities from rural India into the Hindu fold, for example, where some of the most disenfranchised members of the population struggle to eke out a living, and where Christians constitute the most prominent threatening other, may vary from those kinds of strategies used amongst communities in urban contexts elsewhere in India. In Leicester, similarly, leaders from all sides agree that the growing disenfranchisement among young people in the city's sizable South Asian community makes the area rife for extremist ideologies, both Hindu and Muslim, to take root. Local councillor Rita Patel notes that over the past decade, local services for young people have been hollowed out by austerity measures. The coronavirus then disproportionately affected the area, and the current cost of living crisis is further aggravating economic inequality. To quote Councillor Patel, "When you look back in hindsight, you can see that the warning signs were there. At a time when people are just struggling to survive, they are vulnerable to all sorts of things." In other words, the tensions we've witnessed in both Central India and UK contexts are not down to religious or communal politics alone. What these events have in common is ongoing neglect by the Indian and British state, leaving a socio-economic gap into which powerful ideologies that promise economic and social well-being can be easily slotted. With this, I hope that the connections I've tried to make between these two seemingly different contexts are clear. Whether Central India or Leicester, we have seen how people's lives are impacted by factors that transcend ethnic and religious identities. As one commentator notes, the sorts of events that play out in places like Leicester do not just erupt or exist in silos. Rather, they feed into and reinforce each other. To take this into account, as another commentator observes, is not to apportion blame. Ignoring it, however, won't help us fully understand what is happening. And to conclude with a quote from Councillor Patel, I think this is a wake-up call for all of us.